Welcome, friend, to this gentle journey through time where we'll explore one of history's most remarkable transformations. Tonight, we follow the extraordinary story of a young princess who would reshape the world itself. Whether you're settling in for sleep or simply seeking a peaceful escape from your day, I'm grateful you've chosen to spend this quiet hour with me. If this kind of soothing historical storytelling brings you comfort, consider subscribing for more tales that can carry you softly into the night. The morning mist clung to the stone walls of Madrigal de las Altas Torres as a young girl of 3 years old took her first tentative steps across the cold flagstones of her father's castle. The year was 1454, and Isabella of Castile had no way of knowing that these childhood footsteps would one day echo across continents she had never heard of, in lands that existed only in the fevered dreams of explorers and madmen. Picture her there in that draughty castle, wrapped in layers of wool against the Spanish winter, her small fingers tracing the ancient carvings on the chapel walls, while her tutors droned on about Latin conjugations and royal lineages. The castle of Madrigal was hardly the most prestigious residence in Castile, but it would serve as home to this future architect of empire during her most formative years. Isabella's daily routine began before dawn, as was customary for royal children of the 15th century. A servant girl would gently shake her awake in her narrow bed, the mattress stuffed with straw and covered with rough linen sheets that scratched against her skin. The stone floors were so cold that even in summer she would quickly slip her feet into leather slippers before standing. There was no glass in the windows of her chamber, only wooden shutters that did little to keep out the mountain air that swept down from the Guadarrama peaks. Her first task each morning was prayer, kneeling on the hard stone floor of the castle's small chapel while Father Martinez led her through the morning devotions. The priest's voice echoed in the cramped space, mixing with the sound of wind whistling through the gaps in the ancient masonry. Isabella would close her eyes and try to focus on the words, but often her mind wandered to the stories her wet nurse had told her the night before, tales of brave knights and distant kingdoms that seemed far more exciting than the repetitive Latin phrases she was required to memorize. After prayers came the morning meal, usually consisting of coarse bread, watered wine, and whatever meat had been preserved from the previous day's hunt. Isabella would sit at the high table with her younger brother Alfonso, who was just 2 years her junior, while servants scurried around them, preparing for the day's activities. The hall was perpetually dim, lit only by narrow windows set high in the walls, and the occasional torch that cast dancing shadows across the rough-hewn beams overhead. The education of a Castilian princess in the mid-15th century was designed to prepare her for a life of political marriage and religious devotion, but Isabella's circumstances were far from typical. Her father, John II of Castile, was a weak king dominated by his nobles and constantly embroiled in civil wars that had been tearing the kingdom apart for decades. Her half-brother Henry, who would inherit the throne, was already showing signs of the ineffectual leadership that would later earn him the cruel nickname Henry the Impotent. Isabella's tutors were a mixed collection of minor clerics and impoverished nobles who had found refuge in her father's court. They taught her to read and write in both Castilian and Latin, though her Latin remained rudimentary throughout her childhood. More importantly, they instilled in her a deep sense of Christian piety that would guide every major decision of her later life. She learned to embroider, to play simple melodies on the lute, and to conduct herself with the dignified bearing expected of royal blood. But perhaps the most crucial education Isabella received came not from her formal tutors, but from simply observing the chaos that surrounded her father's court. She watched as powerful nobles manipulated the weak king, extracting privileges and territories in exchange for temporary loyalty. She saw how the kingdom's finances were constantly strained by endless military campaigns that achieved nothing but further devastation. She witnessed the corruption of officials who enriched themselves while ordinary Castilians suffered under crushing tax burdens. In the afternoons, when her formal lessons were complete, Isabella would often climb to the highest tower of Madrigal Castle, and gaze out across the vast Castilian landscape. The view from that tower encompassed rolling hills dotted with sheep, small villages where smoke rose from countless hearths, and in the distance, the snow-capped peaks of the central mountain ranges that divided her father's kingdom. She could see the great roads that connected Castile to the rest of Europe, dusty arteries along which travelled merchants, pilgrims, and armies that brought news of the wider world. During these quiet moments of contemplation, Isabella began to develop the vision that would later transform not just Castile, but the entire known world. She understood instinctively that the fragmented, war-torn kingdom she was inheriting could become something far greater. The same geographic position that made Castile a crossroads for European trade and warfare could also make it the launching point for expeditions to lands beyond the horizon. The castle's library, though modest by the standards of great European courts, contained chronicles and maps that fired Isabella's imagination. She would spend hours poring over accounts of the Crusades, reading about Christian knights who had carried the faith to distant lands. She studied the writings of ancient geographers who described mysterious continents beyond the Western Sea. Most fascinating of all were the reports of Portuguese explorers who were beginning to round the coast of Africa in search of a sea route to the spice markets of the East. Isabella's relationship with her younger brother Alfonso was particularly close during these formative years. The two children were natural allies in the complex world of court politics, and they spent countless hours together exploring every corner of Madrigal Castle. Alfonso shared Isabella's intellectual curiosity, but lacked her driving ambition and steel-hard determination. He was content to listen to her increasingly sophisticated political theories, but he never displayed the ruthless pragmatism that would make his sister one of history's most effective rulers. Their games often involved elaborate fantasies about ruling a united Christian kingdom that would drive the Muslims from Spanish soil and carry the cross to the ends of the earth. They would create imaginary maps showing vast territories that acknowledged Castilian sovereignty, and they would plan military campaigns against fictional enemies who threatened their make-believe empire. These childhood games were remarkably prescient, anticipating with startling accuracy the actual conquests that Isabella would later sponsor. The political education Isabella received through direct observation of her father's failures was supplemented by careful study of Castilian history and law. Her tutors made sure she understood the complex feudal relationships that bound the kingdom together, the ancient privileges enjoyed by different cities and regions, and the delicate balance of power between the crown and the great noble houses. This knowledge would prove invaluable when she later needed to navigate the treacherous waters of succession politics. And religious instruction occupied a central place in Isabella's daily routine. But her approach to Christianity was notably practical rather than mystical. She learned to see the church not just as a spiritual institution, but as a powerful political and economic force that could either support or undermine royal authority. Her confessors taught her that earthly rulers had a divine obligation to protect and expand Christian civilization, a lesson that would later provide moral justification for some of the most ambitious imperial projects in human history. The meals served in Madrigal Castle reflected the kingdom's economic struggles during Isabella's childhood. Even royal tables rarely featured the exotic spices and imported delicacies that graced the courts of France or England. Instead, the menu consisted mainly of local products: mutton from the castle's flocks, bread baked from Castilian wheat, wine from nearby vineyards, and olive oil pressed from groves that had been planted during the Roman occupation centuries earlier. This enforced simplicity taught Isabella to appreciate the natural wealth of her homeland, while also making her acutely aware of the kingdom's need for new sources of revenue. The servants who maintained Madrigal Castle came from the surrounding villages, and their conversations provided Isabella with insights into the daily struggles of ordinary Castilians. She learned about the crushing tax burdens imposed to fund her father's wars, the disruption caused by armies marching back and forth across the countryside, and the constant fear of raids by Muslim forces from the southern kingdom of Granada. These conversations helped her understand that effective rulership required more than just military victory. It demanded policies that would improve the lives of common people. As Isabella grew from early childhood into adolescence, her daily routine gradually evolved to include more sophisticated political and diplomatic instruction. She began receiving visitors from other European courts, learning the subtle arts of negotiation and alliance building that were essential skills for any medieval ruler. These encounters taught her to evaluate potential allies and enemies with cold-eyed realism, setting aside personal preferences in favor of strategic calculations. The correspondence that flowed through Madrigal Castle kept Isabella informed about developments throughout Europe and beyond. Letters from Rome brought news of papal politics and theological controversies. Reports from the Eastern Mediterranean described the expanding Ottoman Empire that threatened Christian Europe. Most intriguingly, dispatches from Portuguese courts contained tantalizing hints about African gold mines and sea routes to Asian markets that could revolutionize European trade. During the long winter evenings, when the mountain winds made travel impossible and the castle was effectively cut off from the outside world, Isabella would gather with her small court in the great hall for entertainment that combined pleasure with continued education. Traveling musicians would perform songs that celebrated Castilian military victories, while storytellers recounted legends about Christian heroes who had fought against impossible odds to defend their faith. These performances reinforced Isabella's growing conviction that she was destined to play a crucial role in the ongoing struggle between Christianity and Islam. The physical environment of Madrigal Castle shaped Isabella's character in ways that would influence her entire approach to rulership. The harsh mountain climate taught her to endure discomfort without complaint. The constant need to conserve resources in an isolated fortress instilled habits of frugality that would later help her manage royal finances more effectively than most of her contemporaries. The defensive architecture that surrounded her daily life reinforced her understanding that political power ultimately rested on military strength and strategic positioning. As she entered her teenage years, Isabella began to grasp the full complexity of the political situation she would eventually inherit. Castile was not just weakened by internal divisions and external enemies, it was also falling behind in the great European competition for overseas expansion and trade. While Portuguese navigators were establishing footholds along the African coast and Italian city-states were financing expeditions to distant markets, Castile remained focused on the exhausting struggle to complete the reconquest of Islamic Spain. The princess, who would one day commission Christopher Columbus and authorize the conquest of entire continents, was taking shape during these formative years at Madrigal Castle. Every aspect of her daily experience was preparing her for the extraordinary challenges that lay ahead, though she could hardly have imagined the scope of the transformation she would eventually orchestrate. The morning bells of Madrigal would ring across the courtyard as Isabella approached her 13th birthday, their bronze voices carrying news that would forever alter the trajectory of her life. A messenger had arrived during the night, his horse lathered with sweat from the desperate ride across the Castilian plains, bearing word that her father, King John II, had finally succumbed to the illness that had been slowly consuming him for months. Isabella received this news while kneeling in the castle chapel, her hands clasped in prayer as she had done every morning since childhood. The priest's voice faltered as he delivered the message, and for a moment the only sound in the small stone chamber was the whisper of wind through the narrow windows. The girl who would one day command fleets across unknown oceans remained perfectly still, her face betraying no emotion as she processed the implications of her father's death. With John II gone, her half-brother Henry ascended to the throne as Henry IV, a development that immediately transformed Isabella's position from that of a relatively insignificant princess into a crucial piece in the deadly chess game of Castilian succession politics. Henry's reign had begun years earlier with great promise, but his inability to produce a legitimate heir and his increasingly erratic behavior had created a power vacuum that ambitious nobles were eager to exploit. The first major change in Isabella's life came with her relocation from the isolated castle of Madrigal to the more sophisticated court at Segovia. The journey itself was an education in the complexities of royal logistics, as her small entourage wound its way across the central plateau of Castile, stopping each night at castles and monasteries where local nobles paid their respects to the new king's sister. Segovia represented a dramatic contrast to the austere environment where Isabella had spent her childhood. The Alcazar perched dramatically on its rocky promontory above the confluence of two rivers, its fairy tale towers and elaborate decorations reflecting the wealth and artistic sophistication that Castilian kings had accumulated during centuries of successful warfare against their Muslim neighbours. The palace's rooms were larger and more luxuriously appointed than anything Isabella had previously experienced, with tapestries depicting heroic battles, furniture inlaid with precious metals, and windows glazed with glass that allowed clear views of the surrounding countryside. Her daily routine at Segovia began with the same religious observances she had practiced at Madrigal, but the chapel here was far grander, with painted frescoes illustrating biblical scenes and an altar decorated with gold and silver vessels that reflected the flickering light of dozens of candles. The morning prayers were attended not just by Isabella and a handful of servants, but by a full congregation of courtiers, visiting dignitaries, and church officials who had gathered to pay their respects to the royal family. The meals served at Segovia's high table reflected the court's enhanced status and resources. Instead of simple bread and preserved meat, Isabella now dined on elaborate dishes prepared by skilled cooks who had learned their craft in the kitchens of Europe's most prestigious courts. Roasted peacocks were served with their feathers restored, creating spectacular displays that impressed visiting ambassadors. Imported wines from France and Germany complemented local varieties, while exotic spices from distant markets added flavors that Isabella had never before experienced. But perhaps the most significant change in Isabella's daily life was the dramatic expansion of her political education. At Segovia, she was exposed to a constant stream of ambassadors, military commanders, church officials, and noble representatives who came to negotiate with King Henry about matters ranging from local disputes to international treaties. Isabella was expected to attend many of these meetings, sitting silently at her brother's side while absorbing lessons about statecraft that no book could provide. The conversations she witnessed revealed the full extent of Castile's problems and opportunities. Military commanders reported on the ongoing struggle against Granada, the last Muslim kingdom in Spain, describing both victories and setbacks in campaigns that had been continuing for generations. Church officials discussed the complex relationship between royal and papal authority, explaining how religious questions could become political weapons in the hands of skilled diplomats. Most fascinating of all were the reports from merchants and sea captains who brought news of Portuguese expeditions along the African coast, and their discoveries of gold mines and trading posts that were generating enormous wealth. Isabella's formal education at Segovia was far more sophisticated than anything available at Madrigal. Her new tutors included some of the most learned men in Castile, scholars who had studied at the great universities of Salamanca and Valladolid, and who could provide insights into law, theology, history, and natural philosophy that would prove invaluable in her later career. She learned to read Latin fluently enough to study classical texts in their original form, and she began to develop the analytical skills that would later enable her to evaluate complex political and military situations with remarkable clarity. The library at Segovia contained manuscripts and printed books that opened entirely new intellectual horizons for the teenage princess. She discovered the works of ancient geographers who had speculated about lands beyond the known world, and she studied contemporary accounts of Portuguese exploration that suggested these speculations might be more than mere fantasy. Most importantly, she encountered detailed analyses of successful kingdoms and empires throughout history, learning how effective rulers had managed to expand their territories, increase their revenues, and maintain the loyalty of their subjects. Her relationship with King Henry during this period was complex and often tense. The king was 29 years older than Isabella, and had already established patterns of behavior that she found both personally distasteful and politically dangerous. His court was notorious for its moral laxity, with favourites who seemed more interested in personal enrichment than effective governance. Henry's marriage to Joanna of Portugal had produced a daughter whose legitimacy was widely questioned, creating a succession crisis that would eventually engulf the entire kingdom. Isabella's own marriage prospects became a subject of intense diplomatic negotiation during her years at Segovia. Various European princes were proposed as potential husbands, each alliance offering different strategic advantages and disadvantages for Castile. The King of Portugal sought to strengthen his influence over Castilian affairs by proposing his own brother as Isabella's husband. The King of France suggested one of his younger sons, hoping to create an alliance that would encircle their mutual enemy, the Kingdom of Aragon. Even representatives of the Holy Roman Emperor explored the possibility of a marriage that would bind Castile to the Habsburg cause, but Isabella had begun to develop her own ideas about marriage and political alliance. Ideas that would prove far more ambitious than anything her advisors had imagined. She understood that the right marriage could provide not just personal security, but the foundation for a partnership that could transform Castile from a fragmented, war-torn kingdom into the dominant power in Christian Europe. The prince she had in mind was Ferdinand of Aragon, heir to a kingdom that controlled extensive territories in the Western Mediterranean and maintained trading connections throughout the known world. The daily life of a teenage princess at Segovia included elaborate ceremonial obligations that served both to reinforce royal dignity and to provide training in the performance of majesty that would be essential for effective rulership. Isabella learned to move with the measured grace expected of royalty, to speak in the formal cadences appropriate to state occasions, and to maintain the emotional control necessary for public appearances, even during times of personal or political crisis. Her wardrobe reflected her elevated status, with gowns made from imported silks and decorated with precious metals and gems that demonstrated Castilian wealth and sophistication. But Isabella was already developing the preference for relative simplicity that would characterize her mature style, choosing clothes that were elegant rather than ostentatious, and avoiding the excessive luxury that she associated with political weakness and moral corruption. The musical education she received at Segovia introduced her to sophisticated compositions from throughout Europe, but she showed particular interest in the martial music of Castile, songs that celebrated military victories and religious devotion in equal measure. These musical preferences reflected her growing conviction that her destiny lay not in the refined pleasures of courtly life, but in the hard work of conquest and empire building that would require both spiritual dedication and military prowess. As Isabella approached her 17th birthday, the political situation in Castile was becoming increasingly unstable. King Henry's failures as a ruler had created opportunities for powerful nobles who sought to enhance their own positions at the expense of royal authority. The question of succession loomed larger with each passing month, as it became clear that Henry was unlikely to produce a legitimate male heir who could unite the kingdom under strong leadership. The princess who had begun her life in the modest castle of Madrigal was now positioned at the centre of European diplomacy, her marriage prospects discussed in royal courts from London to Constantinople. But Isabella had already begun to formulate plans that would exceed the wildest ambitions of her potential suitors, dreams of empire that would carry Castilian power to continents that existed only in the speculations of visionary geographers and the prayers of ambitious missionaries. The negotiations for Isabella's marriage to Ferdinand of Aragon required a level of diplomatic secrecy that would have impressed even the most seasoned ambassadors of Renaissance Europe. Throughout the winter of 1468, coded messages passed between Segovia and the Aragonese court, carried by merchants who appeared to be conducting routine business, but were actually orchestrating one of the most consequential political alliances in European history. Isabella's daily routine during this period involved careful preparation for meetings that officially never took place. She would rise before dawn and make her way through the castle's shadowy corridors to a small chamber where trusted advisors briefed her on the latest developments in the marriage negotiations. These conversations had to be conducted in whispers, as King Henry had explicitly forbidden any discussion of a union with Aragon, preferring instead to pursue an alliance with Portugal that would serve his own political interests rather than those of Castile. The deception required Isabella to maintain a perfect facade of obedience during her public appearances at court. She would attend morning mass with her usual devotion, participate in ceremonial meals with appropriate dignity, and engage in the elaborate social rituals that filled the days of royal courts throughout Europe. But beneath this surface of compliance, she was systematically building the network of allies and resources that would be necessary to defy her half-brother's authority when the moment came to act. Her education during this period focused intensively on the practical skills she would need as a ruling queen. Isabella spent hours each day studying the legal codes that governed inheritance and succession in Castile, memorizing the complex feudal obligations that bound different regions to the crown, and learning to evaluate the financial records that revealed the true state of royal revenues and expenses. This knowledge would prove invaluable when she later needed to convince skeptical nobles that her claim to the throne was both legally valid and politically advantageous. The correspondence that flowed through Isabella's chambers during these months came from sources throughout Europe and beyond. Portuguese sea captains sent reports about their latest discoveries along the African coast, describing gold mines and trading posts that were generating unprecedented wealth for the Lusitanian crown. Italian merchants provided detailed accounts of the spice trade with Asia, explaining how control of these lucrative markets could transform any kingdom willing to invest in the necessary expeditions. Most intriguingly, a handful of visionary explorers had begun to propose even more ambitious schemes, involving westward voyages across the Atlantic Ocean to reach the Indies by an entirely new route. Isabella's evening meals at Segovia became informal councils of war, where trusted advisors discussed the strategic implications of various political scenarios. If her marriage to Ferdinand proceeded as planned, the combined resources of Castile and Aragon could support military campaigns that would finally drive the Muslims from Granada, while simultaneously launching overseas expeditions that might rival or exceed Portuguese achievements. The conversations that took place over these dinner tables involved calculations about military logistics, diplomatic alliances, and economic projections that were remarkable for their scope and sophistication. The castle's library became Isabella's primary refuge during this period of intense political preparation. She would spend entire afternoons studying the chronicles of successful rulers throughout history, analyzing their methods of conquest, administration, and empire building, with the focused attention of a military strategist planning a campaign. The books that surrounded her contained accounts of Alexander's march to India, Caesar's conquest of Gaul, and Charlemagne's creation of a Christian empire that had dominated medieval Europe. These historical examples provided models for the kind of transformative leadership Isabella was beginning to envision for herself. Her physical training during this period reflected the practical demands she expected to face as a ruling queen. Isabella learned to ride with the skill of a cavalry officer, practicing maneuvers that would allow her to accompany armies in the field and maintain personal command over military operations. She studied the use of weapons, not because she expected to engage in personal combat, but because understanding military technology was essential for effective strategic planning. Most importantly, she developed the physical stamina and emotional resilience that would be necessary for the exhausting demands of active rulership. The religious observances that structured Isabella's daily routine took on increased political significance during this period. Her prayers in the castle chapel were attended not just by personal servants, but by representatives of various noble families who wanted to demonstrate their loyalty to the future queen. These religious gatherings provided opportunities for discreet political communication, as supporters could express their views through carefully chosen biblical readings and religious songs that carried coded messages about contemporary political situations. The elaborate ceremonial meals served at Segovia during Isabella's final months at court reflected the kingdom's growing prosperity despite its political instability. The kitchens produced dishes that incorporated spices from Portuguese trading posts in Africa and Asia, demonstrating Castile's access to international markets, while also highlighting the opportunities that more systematic overseas expansion might provide. Isabella paid careful attention to these displays of wealth, understanding that effective rulership required not just military and political skill, but also the ability to project prosperity and confidence that would attract allies and intimidate enemies. Her correspondence with Ferdinand of Aragon intensified throughout the spring of 1469, as the two young royals developed both a personal relationship and a shared vision for the transformation of Iberian politics. Their letters, written in a cipher that had been developed specifically for their communications, discussed everything from immediate tactical concerns about their secret marriage to long-term strategic plans for conquests that would carry their combined kingdom's influence across multiple continents. The intelligence network that Isabella had begun to construct during her teenage years provided detailed information about political developments throughout Europe and beyond. Agents in various royal courts reported on diplomatic negotiations, military preparations, and economic conditions that might affect Castilian interests. Merchants who travelled the trade routes between Spain and distant markets provided regular updates about opportunities for commercial expansion. Most crucially, her spies within King Henry's own court kept her informed about his plans and the extent of noble support for his increasingly unpopular policies. Isabella's daily schedule during the summer of 1469 involved increasingly complex preparations for what she knew would be the most dangerous gamble of her young life. The decision to marry Ferdinand against her half-brother's explicit orders would constitute an act of open rebellion that could result in civil war, foreign invasion, or her own execution if the political calculations proved incorrect. But the alternative of accepting Henry's preferred marriage to the King of Portugal would mean abandoning her ambitions for Castilian greatness and accepting a subordinate role in someone else's imperial project. The secret negotiations that culminated in Isabella's escape from Segovia required careful coordination between multiple groups of conspirators operating in different parts of Castile. Noble families who supported her claim to eventual succession had to position their retainers to provide protection during her journey to meet Ferdinand. Church officials who favoured the Aragonese alliance needed to arrange for religious ceremonies that would legitimise the marriage despite royal opposition. Military commanders who doubted King Henry's competence had to ensure that their forces would not interfere with Isabella's movements. The morning of Isabella's departure from Segovia began like any other day in her carefully regulated routine. She attended Mass in the castle chapel, participated in the formal breakfast with other members of the royal household, and engaged in the usual round of ceremonial activities that filled the hours of court life. But beneath this facade of normalcy, her supporters were making final preparations for an enterprise that would either secure her position as future queen of a united Spain or destroy her completely. The horse that carried Isabella away from Segovia in the pre-dawn darkness of October 1469 was bred from the finest Andalusian stock, selected for both speed and endurance to ensure that the most crucial journey of her young life could be completed before King Henry's forces could organise pursuit. The small party of loyal retainers who accompanied her had been chosen for their military skill and absolute personal devotion. Men who were willing to risk everything for the chance to serve a ruler who might transform Castile from a fragmented kingdom into the foundation of a global empire. As the towers of Segovia disappeared behind them in the morning mist, Isabella understood that she was crossing a threshold from which there could be no return. The teenage princess who had spent her childhood dreaming of conquest and empire was about to become a fugitive rebel whose survival would depend entirely on her ability to inspire loyalty, outmaneuver enemies, and create the political and military alliances necessary to claim a throne that rightfully belonged to her. The road that stretched ahead led first to Valladolid, where Ferdinand of Aragon was waiting with his own small party of supporters. But ultimately it would carry Isabella far beyond anything she could have imagined during those quiet afternoons in Madrigal Castle, when she had first begun to dream of transforming the world through the power of Castilian arms and Christian faith. The ancient stones of Valladolid had witnessed countless royal ceremonies throughout the centuries, but none quite like the clandestine wedding that took place in a modest palace chamber on October 19th, 1469. Isabella's hands trembled slightly as she knelt beside Ferdinand of Aragon in the candlelit room, not from nervousness about marriage, but from the electric awareness that this moment would either secure her destiny or seal her doom. The ceremony itself was deliberately simple, attended by only a handful of trusted witnesses who understood that they were participating in an act of rebellion that could cost them their lives. The priest who performed the marriage spoke the Latin words quickly and quietly, as if volume might somehow attract the attention of King Henry's spies, who were already scouring the countryside for his fugitive sister. Ferdinand, just 17 years old but already seasoned by years of political intrigue in the complex court of Aragon, stood with the confidence of someone who had been preparing for this moment his entire life. His dark eyes never left Isabella's face during the brief ceremony, and she could see in his expression the same burning ambition that had driven her own dreams of empire and conquest. When the final blessing was pronounced and the simple gold rings exchanged, Isabella felt a profound shift in her understanding of her own identity. She was no longer merely a Castilian princess whose future depended on the whims of her half-brother's political calculations. She had become the co-ruler of a potential empire that could span continents, command vast armies, and reshape the balance of power throughout the known world. The wedding feast that followed was necessarily modest, consisting of local wines and simple dishes that reflected the conspirators' need to avoid attracting attention. But the conversations that filled the small dining chamber were anything but simple, as the newlyweds and their supporters began planning the political and military campaigns that would be necessary to transform their secret marriage into the foundation of a new dynasty. Isabella's first days as Ferdinand's wife were spent in the fortified palace of Dueñas, where loyal nobles had gathered to offer their support for what everyone understood would be a struggle for the very soul of Castile. The daily routine she established during this period would set the pattern for the rest of her remarkable reign, combining intense political planning with the deep religious devotion that would guide every major decision of her career. Her mornings began with extended prayer sessions in the palace chapel, where she sought divine guidance for the enormous challenges that lay ahead. The stone floor was cold against her knees as she knelt before the simple wooden crucifix. But Isabella had learned during her childhood at Madrigal to find strength in physical discomfort. The prayers she offered during these early morning hours were not just personal petitions for protection and wisdom, but strategic consultations with the divine authority she believed had chosen her for this extraordinary destiny. After prayers came breakfast with Ferdinand and their growing circle of supporters, meals that served as informal war councils, where military commanders, church officials, and loyal nobles shared intelligence about King Henry's response to the marriage and the shifting loyalties of various Castilian factions. Isabella listened carefully to every report, her mind constantly analysing the political implications of each development and calculating the resources that would be necessary to defend their position. The correspondence that flowed through Dueñas during these crucial weeks came from supporters throughout Castile and beyond. Nobles who had grown disgusted with King Henry's weak leadership sent secret messages pledging their allegiance to Isabella and Ferdinand. Church officials who favoured the Aragonese alliance provided detailed intelligence about the political situation in their regions. Most encouragingly, reports arrived from Portuguese and Italian sources, suggesting that European opinion was turning against Henry's ineffectual rule. Isabella's education during this period focused intensively on military strategy and the practical logistics of warfare, She spent hours studying maps of Castilian territory, memorizing the locations of strategic fortresses, analyzing the defensive capabilities of different regions, and calculating the resources that would be necessary to maintain armies in the field for extended campaigns. This knowledge would prove invaluable when civil war finally erupted, and she needed to make rapid decisions about troop movements and supply lines. The intelligence network that Isabella had begun developing during her teenage years at Segovia now expanded dramatically as loyal agents throughout Castile provided regular updates about King Henry's military preparations and the loyalty of various noble families. These reports painted a complex picture of a kingdom deeply divided between supporters of the traditional monarchy and those who favoured the kind of strong leadership that Isabella and Ferdinand represented. Her daily schedule during the winter of 1469 included extensive planning sessions for the overseas expeditions that both she and Ferdinand understood would be necessary to finance their domestic political ambitions. The gold and silver flowing into Portuguese coffers from African trading posts demonstrated the enormous wealth that systematic exploration could generate, and both young rulers were determined to secure similar resources for their own kingdoms. The books and manuscripts that filled Isabella's temporary library at Dueñas reflected her evolving understanding of the scope of her imperial ambitions. She studied accounts of Portuguese expeditions along the African coast, analysing their methods of establishing trading posts and extracting wealth from local populations. She examined reports about the spice trade with Asia, calculating the profits that could be generated by finding alternative routes to these lucrative markets. Most intriguingly, she began corresponding with visionary explorers who claimed that sailing westward across the Atlantic Ocean might provide a direct route to the Indies. The religious dimension of Isabella's daily routine took on increased political significance during this period, as she began to develop the theological framework that would later justify some of the most ambitious imperial projects in human history. Her confessors taught her that Christian rulers had a divine obligation to expand the faith into new territories, a lesson that provided moral authorization for conquests that might otherwise have appeared motivated purely by greed for gold and territory. The elaborate meals served at Dueñas reflected the growing confidence of Isabella's supporters and their increasing access to resources from throughout Europe. Portuguese wines appeared on the table alongside Castilian varieties, while spices from distant trading posts added exotic flavours that hinted at the commercial opportunities awaiting successful overseas expansion. These culinary displays served both to impress visiting dignitaries and to reinforce Isabella's vision of a Castilian empire that would rival the greatest kingdoms of antiquity. Her relationship with Ferdinand, during these early months of marriage, evolved from political alliance into genuine partnership based on shared ambitions and complementary skills. Ferdinand brought to the union extensive knowledge of Mediterranean politics and trade, while Isabella contributed her deep understanding of Castilian law and her remarkable ability to inspire loyalty among both nobles and common people. Their evening conversations often lasted late into the night as they refined their plans for military campaigns, diplomatic initiatives, and overseas expeditions that would transform their combined kingdoms into the foundation of a global empire. The physical training that Isabella maintained during this period reflected her determination to be more than a ceremonial ruler who remained safely in the rear while others fought her battles. She continued practicing horsemanship with the skill of a cavalry officer, learning to control her mount during the chaos of battle and to maintain command presence even under the extreme stress of military combat. Her riding costumes were designed for practical use rather than courtly display, with sturdy leather boots and simple woolen cloaks that would not interfere with rapid movement. The fortress of Dueñas became a centre of intellectual activity during Isabella's residence there, as scholars and advisors from throughout Europe gathered to contribute their expertise to the planning of future conquests and expeditions. These men brought with them the latest geographical knowledge, military innovations, and administrative techniques that would be essential for governing the vast territories that Isabella and Ferdinand hoped to acquire through their ambitious campaigns. The correspondence between Isabella and various European courts during this period revealed the growing international recognition of her legitimacy as a future ruler of Castile. Ambassadors from France, England, and the Holy Roman Empire began treating her as a serious political player, whose alliance could significantly affect the balance of power throughout Christian Europe. These diplomatic contacts provided access to the international resources and support that would be necessary for successful military campaigns against both domestic enemies and overseas targets. The daily routine that Isabella established at Dueñas included regular meetings with merchants and sea captains who provided detailed information about commercial opportunities in distant markets. She learned about the spice trade with Asia, the gold mines being discovered along the African coast, and the growing Portuguese dominance of maritime exploration that was generating enormous wealth for their rival kingdom. This commercial intelligence helped shape her understanding of the economic foundations that would be necessary to support the kind of military expansion she was planning. Her wardrobe during this period reflected the practical demands of life as a rebel leader, while maintaining the dignity appropriate to someone who claimed the right to rule one of Europe's most powerful kingdoms. Isabella's gowns were made from the finest available materials, but designed for functionality rather than pure display. She needed clothing that would allow her to ride long distances, attend military councils, and participate in religious ceremonies without the elaborate restrictions that characterized the fashion of more settled royal courts. The religious observances that structured Isabella's days at Dueñas took on increased intensity as she prepared for the military campaigns that would either secure her throne or result in her destruction. She spent hours in meditation and prayer, seeking divine guidance for decisions that would affect not just her own fate, but the future of Christianity in Europe and beyond. The small chapel at Dueñas became her sanctuary, where she could retreat from the constant pressure of political planning to commune with the spiritual forces she believed were directing her extraordinary destiny. As spring approached in 1470, the intelligence reports reaching Dueñas indicated that King Henry was finally preparing to take decisive action against his rebellious sister and her Aragonese husband. Royal armies were being assembled, loyal nobles were being summoned to court, and diplomatic efforts were underway to secure foreign support for military campaigns designed to crush the growing rebellion before it could spread throughout Castile. Isabella's response to these developments demonstrated the steel-hard determination that would characterize her entire approach to rulership. Instead of seeking compromise or attempting to negotiate some face-saving settlement with her half-brother, she began planning offensive operations that would carry the war directly to Henry's supporters and demonstrate to all of Castile that the future belonged to those with the courage and vision to seize it. The woman who had fled Segovia as a fugitive princess was transforming herself into a military commander whose armies would soon march across continents that existed only in the dreams of visionary explorers and the prayers of ambitious missionaries. The teenage girl who had once traced ancient carvings in a castle chapel was preparing to inscribe her name across territories that would make the empires of antiquity seem modest by comparison. The morning mist that rose from the rivers around Dueñas carried with it the promise of campaigns that would reshape the known world, as Isabella prepared to lead her supporters into battles that would either establish her as the founder of a global empire or destroy her utterly in the attempt to achieve the impossible. The war that would determine the future of Spain began not with grand declarations or formal challenges, but with small bands of armed men moving quietly through the olive groves and wheat fields of central Castile during the summer of 1470. Isabella's supporters, now openly calling themselves the League of the Cross, understood that their survival depended on striking quickly before King Henry could consolidate his scattered forces into a coordinated campaign. Isabella's daily routine during these opening months of civil war reflected the harsh realities of military leadership in an age when royal authority was measured by personal presence on the battlefield. She would rise each morning at dawn in whatever castle or fortified manor had provided shelter for the night. her sleeping quarters often nothing more than a simple chamber hastily cleared of furniture to accommodate the travelling court that followed her army. The morning prayers that began each day were conducted in improvised chapels, sometimes merely a corner of a great hall where a portable altar had been erected and candles arranged to create sacred space. Isabella would kneel on the cold stone floors while her chaplain led the assembled soldiers and nobles through the Latin devotions that placed their cause under divine protection. The smell of incense, mixed with the ever-present odours of horses, leather, and unwashed bodies that characterised life in a military camp. Her breakfast consisted of whatever provisions could be gathered from the surrounding countryside, usually hard bread, dried meat, and watered wine that bore little resemblance to the elaborate meals she had enjoyed during her peaceful years at Segovia. But Isabella had learned during her childhood at Madrigal to find strength in simplicity, and she understood that sharing the hardships of campaign life with her followers created bonds of loyalty that no amount of ceremonial splendour could match. The tactical planning sessions that followed each morning meal took place around rough wooden tables where maps were spread and weighted down with daggers to prevent them from curling in the damp air. Isabella would lean over these charts with Ferdinand and their military commanders, tracing potential routes of advance, identifying strategic objectives, and calculating the resources necessary to maintain their forces in the field through the coming winter. These planning discussions revealed the scope of the challenges facing the rebel coalition. King Henry commanded the loyalty of several powerful noble families and could draw upon the traditional resources of the Castilian treasury to fund his military operations. His armies controlled most of the kingdom's major fortresses and could rely on established supply lines that connected the various regions under royal authority. Most troubling of all, Henry had secured promises of military assistance from Portugal and France, foreign powers that viewed Isabella's rebellion as a threat to the established order throughout Europe. But Isabella possessed advantages that her enemies had underestimated. The merit-based approach to military command that she and Ferdinand had adopted attracted talented officers who had been overlooked by the traditional aristocratic system. Their emphasis on religious motivation resonated with common soldiers who saw the war as a struggle between Christian virtue and royal corruption. Most importantly, their promise of overseas expansion offered prospects for wealth and advancement that appealed to younger nobles who were frustrated by the limited opportunities available in a kingdom exhausted by decades of internal warfare. The intelligence network that Isabella had developed during her years of preparation now provided crucial advantages in the rapidly shifting circumstances of civil war. Loyal agents throughout Castile reported on enemy troop movements, the loyalty of various garrison commanders, and the mood of civilian populations in contested territories. This information allowed Isabella's forces to avoid unfavourable battles, while concentrating their attacks on isolated enemy units that could be defeated without excessive casualties. Her correspondence during this period reflected the increasingly international scope of the conflict, as various European powers calculated how the outcome of the Castilian Civil War might affect their own strategic interests. The Duke of Burgundy sent discreet messages of support, hoping that a victory by Isabella and Ferdinand would create an ally against French expansion. Italian city-states offered financial assistance in exchange for future commercial privileges. Even representatives of the Pope began exploring the possibility of official church support for rulers who promised to pursue more aggressive policies against Islamic forces. The daily routine of military campaigning required Isabella to master skills that no previous education had prepared her for. She learned to evaluate the defensive capabilities of fortified positions at a glance, to calculate the time required to move large numbers of troops and equipment across different types of terrain, and to maintain the morale of forces that often went weeks without pay, while living on whatever provisions could be requisitioned from local populations. Her riding costume during these campaigns was designed for practical use rather than royal display. She wore sturdy leather boots that could withstand long hours in the stirrups, woolen cloaks that provided protection against wind and rain, and simple tunics that allowed freedom of movement during the rapid maneuvers that characterized her military style. The only concession to royal dignity was a small golden cross that she wore pinned to her cloak, a symbol that identified her to supporters while proclaiming the religious character of her cause. The evening meals shared with her officers and supporters took place in whatever shelter was available. Often, the great halls of captured castles, where trestle tables were hastily erected and illuminated by torches that cast dancing shadows on ancient stone walls. These gatherings served as informal war councils where intelligence reports were evaluated, future operations planned, and the complex web of personal loyalties that held the rebel coalition together was carefully maintained. Isabella's approach to the treatment of captured enemies revealed the strategic thinking that would later characterize her imperial policies. Rather than executing defeated nobles or confiscating their lands entirely, she offered opportunities for reconciliation that encouraged defections from King Henry's cause, while demonstrating that her ultimate goal was the unification rather than the destruction of Castile. This policy of calculated mercy proved remarkably effective in winning over moderate supporters of the royal cause who had joined Henry more from habit than conviction. The religious services that punctuated the rhythm of campaign life took on special significance as symbols of the moral authority that Isabella claimed for her rebellion. The portable altars carried by her army were decorated with captured banners that proclaimed victories over royal forces, while the prayers offered before battle emphasized divine support for a cause that promised to restore Christian virtue to Castilian government and carry the faith to distant lands through overseas conquest. Her personal weapons training during this period reflected the practical demands of military leadership. In an age when commanders were expected to participate directly in combat, Isabella learned to handle a sword with sufficient skill to defend herself if circumstances required. But more importantly, she mastered the use of the crossbow, a weapon that allowed her to contribute meaningfully to siege operations while maintaining the distance from hand-to-hand combat that was considered appropriate for royal dignity. The books and documents that travelled with Isabella's army included not just military manuals and maps, but also the legal codes and administrative records that would be necessary for governing territories as they were captured from royal forces. She understood that military victory would be meaningless unless it was followed by effective administration that could win the loyalty of civilian populations and provide the resources necessary for future campaigns. The correspondence that flowed between Isabella's travelling court and her supporters throughout Europe included increasingly detailed discussions of the overseas expeditions that would be launched once domestic peace was restored. Portuguese discoveries along the African coast had demonstrated the enormous wealth that systematic exploration could generate, and Isabella was determined to secure similar opportunities for her own kingdom through westward voyages that might reach the Indies by an entirely new route. Her daily schedule during the autumn of 1470 included regular consultations with sea captains and navigators who provided technical expertise about the challenges of oceanic exploration. These men described the ships, equipment, and supplies that would be necessary for long voyages beyond sight of land, while also explaining the potential profits that successful expeditions could generate through trade in spices, precious metals, and other exotic goods. The winter quarters established for Isabella's army at Valladolid reflected her growing confidence in ultimate victory and her determination to demonstrate that her government could provide more effective administration than King Henry's failing regime. The temporary court she established in the ancient city became a centre of intellectual and cultural activity that attracted scholars, artists, and administrators from throughout Europe who wanted to associate themselves with what appeared to be the winning side in the Castilian conflict. The daily routine she maintained at Valladolid combined the practical demands of military planning with the ceremonial obligations of royal authority. Morning prayers in the city's great cathedral were attended by hundreds of supporters who came to demonstrate their loyalty while also participating in religious services that emphasized divine approval for Isabella's cause. These gatherings served both spiritual and political functions, reinforcing the religious character of the rebellion while providing opportunities for discreet political communication. Her administrative work during this period involved creating the governmental structures that would be necessary for ruling a unified Castile once victory was achieved. Isabella established new procedures for tax collection that would provide more reliable revenues than the chaotic system maintained by King Henry's government. She developed standardized legal codes that could be applied consistently throughout her territories, and she began recruiting the capable administrators who would be necessary for governing an expanded kingdom that might eventually span multiple continents. The meals served at Isabella's court during the winter of 1470 reflected both the growing prosperity of her cause and her vision of Castile's international destiny. Portuguese wines appeared alongside local varieties, while spices from distant markets added exotic flavors that hinted at the commercial opportunities awaiting successful overseas expansion. These culinary displays served practical purposes as well as symbolic ones, as visiting dignitaries could observe the wealth and sophistication that Isabella's government was already generating. Her evening discussions with Ferdinand during this period focused increasingly on the specific expeditions they would launch once domestic peace was restored. They studied charts showing Portuguese progress along the African coast and calculated the resources that would be necessary to mount competing voyages. Most intriguingly, they began serious consideration of proposals from visionary navigators who claimed that sailing westward across the Atlantic might provide a direct route to the gold and spices of Asia. The intelligence reports that reached Valladolid throughout the winter painted an increasingly favourable picture of Isabella's military and political prospects. King Henry's forces were deserting in growing numbers as word spread about the effective government and generous treatment that defeated enemies could expect from the rebel cause. Foreign support for the royal regime was weakening as European powers began to recognise that Isabella and Ferdinand represented the future of Iberian politics. The spring campaign of 1471 began with Isabella's forces holding secure control of most of northern Castile and significant portions of the central regions where the civil war had begun. Her army had grown from a handful of loyal retainers into a formidable military force that could challenge royal armies on equal terms, while also maintaining the siege operations necessary to capture the remaining fortresses that protected King Henry's diminishing territory. Isabella's personal command style during this crucial campaign demonstrated the leadership skills that would later enable her to direct imperial expansion across multiple continents. She combined strategic vision with attention to practical details, inspiring her followers with speeches about divine destiny, while also ensuring that her armies were properly supplied and equipped for extended operations. Her presence on the battlefield provided moral authority that proved decisive in several key engagements, where royal forces might otherwise have achieved tactical victories. The decisive battle that effectively ended the Castilian Civil War took place near the ancient city of Toro in March 1476, when Isabella's army destroyed the last significant royal force and captured most of King Henry's remaining supporters. The victory was achieved through a combination of superior tactics, better intelligence, and the moral authority that Isabella had established through years of effective leadership during the most challenging circumstances. As the smoke cleared from the battlefield at Toro and Isabella surveyed the captured banners that would be sent to churches throughout Castile as symbols of divine favour, she understood that the domestic phase of her extraordinary career was coming to an end. The teenage princess, who had fled Segovia as a fugitive rebel, had transformed herself into the undisputed ruler of a unified kingdom that possessed the resources and determination necessary to challenge the greatest empires of the known world. The morning prayers she offered in thanksgiving for victory included petitions for guidance in the far greater challenges that lay ahead. As the woman who had mastered the complex politics of medieval Iberia prepared to launch expeditions that would carry Castilian power to continents that existed only in the dreams of visionary explorers and the calculations of ambitious navigators who claimed that the Indies could be reached by sailing westward into the vast unknown reaches of the Atlantic Ocean. The great Cathedral of Toledo had witnessed the coronation of countless monarchs throughout its storied history, but the ceremony that took place on December 13th, 1474, carried a significance that would echo across oceans not yet explored and continents not yet imagined. Isabella knelt before the high altar as Archbishop Carrillo placed the ancient crown of Castile upon her head, the weight of gold and precious stones seeming almost insignificant compared to the enormous responsibilities that now rested upon her shoulders. The morning of her coronation began before dawn in the modest chamber, where Isabella had spent her final night as merely the wife of Ferdinand of Aragon. A servant girl entered quietly, carrying a basin of warm water, scented with herbs, that had been specially prepared for this most sacred of occasions. Isabella rose from her narrow bed, her feet touching the cold stone floor, as she had done countless times throughout her remarkable journey from powerless princess to sovereign ruler. Her first act as queen-elect was the same that had begun every day of her adult life. She knelt in prayer before a simple wooden crucifix, her hands clasped as she sought divine guidance for the transformative work that lay ahead. The prayers she offered that morning were not just personal petitions for wisdom and strength, but solemn vows to use her newfound authority in service of a vision that would reshape the known world. The elaborate ritual of royal dressing that followed was conducted in reverent silence by ladies-in-waiting who understood they were participating in a moment of historic transformation. Isabella's coronation gown was crafted from the finest Flemish silk, its deep crimson colour symbolising the blood that had been shed to secure her throne, while also representing the Christian faith that would guide her reign. The intricate embroidery that decorated every seam told the story of Castilian history through golden threads that caught the flickering light of dozens of candles. When the cathedral bells announced the beginning of the coronation ceremony, Isabella walked through the ancient streets of Toledo, surrounded by nobles who had supported her cause during the long years of civil war. The crowds that lined her route represented every level of Castilian society, from wealthy merchants who anticipated new opportunities for overseas trade, to common farmers who hoped that effective royal government might finally bring peace to their war-torn homeland. The ceremony itself followed traditions that stretched back centuries, but Isabella's responses to the ritual questions carried undertones of innovation that careful observers found both thrilling and slightly troubling. When asked to swear protection for her subjects, she spoke not just of defending Castile's existing territories, but of expanding Christian civilization into distant lands where the faith had never been proclaimed. When prompted to promise justice for all, she included references to peoples and nations that had not yet submitted to Castilian authority, but might someday find themselves under her rule. The crown that Archbishop Carrillo placed upon Isabella's head had been worn by queens throughout Castilian history, but none of her predecessors had possessed the resources, the vision, or the sheer audacity necessary to transform their kingdom into the foundation of a global empire. The ancient gold seemed to pulse with new energy as it settled upon her brow, as if the accumulated authority of generations was being channeled into projects that would dwarf the achievements of any previous monarch. Isabella's first acts as crowned queen revealed the systematic approach to governance that would characterize her entire reign. Rather than celebrating her victory with elaborate feasts and ceremonies, she immediately began implementing administrative reforms that would provide the resources necessary for the ambitious expeditions she was already planning. Her daily schedule as queen began each morning with extended sessions in the royal council chamber, where she worked with carefully selected advisors to address the complex challenges of ruling a recently unified kingdom. The correspondence that flowed through the royal palace at Toledo during Isabella's first months as queen came from sources throughout Europe and beyond, as foreign courts sought to understand the implications of her remarkable rise to power. Ambassadors from France, England, and the Holy Roman Empire requested audiences to negotiate new treaties and alliances. Portuguese representatives arrived with proposals for dividing the African territories that both kingdoms hoped to explore and exploit. Most intriguingly, a handful of visionary navigators began submitting detailed plans for westward expeditions that might reach the Indies by crossing the Atlantic Ocean. Isabella's approach to these diplomatic overtures reflected the strategic thinking that had enabled her survival during years of civil war. She understood that Castile's geographic position at the crossroads between Europe and Africa provided unique opportunities for overseas expansion, but also created vulnerabilities that required careful management of international relationships. Her responses to foreign proposals were polite, but non-committal, as she worked to maintain diplomatic flexibility while building the military and economic resources necessary for independent action. The daily routine she established as queen included extensive consultations with merchants, sea captains, and other experts who could provide practical information about the challenges and opportunities of overseas exploration. Isabella would spend entire afternoons in the royal library studying maps, charts, and written accounts of Portuguese discoveries along the African coast. She memorized the locations of trading posts, calculated the distances between supply stations, and analyzed the profits that systematic exploration was generating for her rival kingdom. Her evening meals as queen were working dinners where carefully selected guests provided intelligence about developments throughout the known world. Italian bankers described the enormous profits generated by the spice trade with Asia, while explaining the financial mechanisms that could fund large-scale expeditions to establish competing trade routes. Genoese navigators shared technical knowledge about shipbuilding, navigation, and the supplies necessary for voyages beyond sight of land. Most fascinatingly, a few scholarly priests discussed theological questions about the obligations of Christian rulers to carry their faith to populations that had never heard the gospel message. The royal wardrobe that Isabella maintained during her early years as queen reflected both her elevated status and her practical approach to governance. Her everyday gowns were made from the finest available materials, but designed for functionality rather than pure display. She needed clothing that would allow her to ride long distances when traveling to different parts of her kingdom, to participate in military planning sessions, and to maintain royal dignity during the exhausting ceremonial obligations that filled her days. The religious observances that structured Isabella's daily routine as queen took on increased political significance as she began implementing the domestic reforms that would provide resources for overseas expansion. She established new procedures for church administration that would generate more reliable revenues, while also ensuring that religious institutions supported rather than competed with royal authority. Her morning prayers in the royal chapel were attended by increasing numbers of courtiers and visiting dignitaries who wanted to demonstrate their loyalty while also observing the spiritual devotion that guided her decision-making. The administrative innovations that Isabella implemented during her first years as queen revealed the sophisticated understanding of governmental efficiency that she had developed during her years of political education. She created new departments responsible for managing overseas trade, coordinating military expeditions, and maintaining diplomatic relationships with foreign courts. The officials she appointed to these positions were selected based on demonstrated competence rather than noble birth, a revolutionary approach that attracted talented individuals from throughout Europe who wanted to serve in what was clearly becoming one of the most dynamic governments in Christendom. Her personal study in the royal palace became a center of intellectual activity, where scholars, explorers, and administrators gathered to contribute their expertise to the planning of expeditions that would carry Castilian influence to the ends of the earth. The room was lined with maps showing the latest geographical discoveries, while tables were covered with charts, letters, and technical documents that provided detailed information about navigation, shipbuilding, and the practical challenges of establishing settlements in distant territories. The correspondence between Isabella and various European courts during this period revealed the growing international recognition of Castile's potential for overseas expansion. Rulers who had previously dismissed her kingdom as a minor regional power began treating her as a serious competitor whose success could significantly affect the balance of global trade and political influence. These diplomatic contacts provided access to the technical knowledge, financial resources, and strategic partnerships that would be necessary for mounting expeditions to rival Portuguese achievements. Isabella's daily schedule during the winter of 1475 included regular meetings with Christopher Columbus, the Genoese navigator whose westward voyage proposal was gradually gaining support despite its apparent impossibility. Their conversations took place in the Queen's private study, where Columbus would spread his charts across the polished wooden table, while explaining his calculations about wind patterns, ocean currents, and the distances that would need to be traversed to reach the Indies by sailing directly west across the Atlantic. The practical preparations for what would become the most consequential voyage in human history began with seemingly mundane administrative tasks that Isabella supervised personally. She reviewed contracts with shipbuilders who would construct the vessels necessary for oceanic exploration, evaluated proposals from suppliers who could provide the food, water, and equipment required for extended voyages, and interviewed potential crew members whose skills and loyalty would determine the success or failure of expeditions to unknown territories. Her approach to financing these preparations revealed the systematic thinking that had enabled her political success during years of civil war. Rather than relying solely on royal revenues, Isabella developed innovative arrangements with private investors who would share the risks and profits of overseas exploration. These partnerships attracted capital from throughout Europe, while also creating networks of supporters who had personal stakes in the success of Castilian expeditions. The religious dimension of Isabella's expansion planning reflected her genuine conviction that Christian rulers had divine obligations to carry their faith to populations that had never encountered the gospel message. She established procedures for training missionaries who would accompany exploratory expeditions, developed guidelines for treating indigenous populations according to Christian principles, and created administrative structures for governing new territories that would be discovered through westward voyages. The intelligence network that Isabella had inherited from her years as a rebel leader now provided crucial information about Portuguese activities along the African coast and their plans for future expansion into Asian markets. Regular reports described the wealth being generated by Portuguese trading posts, the military methods used to establish and defend overseas settlements, and the diplomatic relationships that Portugal was developing with various African and Asian rulers. Isabella's response to this intelligence was characteristically ambitious and systematic. Rather than simply copying Portuguese methods, she began planning expeditions that would establish Castilian supremacy through more aggressive expansion and more efficient exploitation of discovered territories. Her vision extended far beyond mere trading posts to encompass permanent settlements that would serve as bases for further exploration and conquest throughout newly discovered regions. The daily routine that Isabella maintained during the spring of 1476 reflected the increasing urgency of her expansion planning as reports arrived of new Portuguese discoveries and competing expeditions being organized by other European powers. She would rise each morning before dawn to review the latest intelligence reports, then spend hours in planning sessions where every detail of proposed expeditions was analyzed and refined. Her breakfast meetings with Ferdinand during this period focused intensively on coordinating their respective resources and expertise for the massive undertaking of overseas expansion. Ferdinand brought to their discussions extensive knowledge of Mediterranean trade and naval warfare, while Isabella contributed her understanding of Castilian law and her remarkable ability to inspire loyalty among both nobles and common people. Their combined capabilities created possibilities for expansion that neither kingdom could have achieved independently. The maps that covered the walls of Isabella's study during this period included not just established geographical knowledge, but also speculative charts showing possible routes to Asia and hypothetical territories that might be discovered through systematic exploration. She would spend hours studying these documents, tracing potential voyages with her finger while calculating the resources and time that different expeditions would require. Her correspondence with potential expedition leaders revealed the careful evaluation process she used to select commanders for voyages that would determine the future of her kingdom. Isabella sought navigators who combined technical competence with absolute personal loyalty, men who could be trusted to represent Castilian interests effectively, while also being capable of making independent decisions during emergencies that might arise thousands of miles from home. The contracts that Isabella negotiated for these expeditions established precedents for imperial administration that would influence European overseas expansion for centuries. She insisted on detailed provisions for claiming discovered territories in the name of Castile, for establishing governmental authority over indigenous populations, and for ensuring that the Crown received appropriate shares of any wealth that expeditions might generate. The financial mechanisms that Isabella developed to fund these preparations involved innovations in banking and investment that attracted capital from throughout Europe, while also creating economic incentives for successful exploration. She established procedures for sharing risks and profits among multiple investors, developed standardized contracts for expedition financing, and created administrative systems for managing the complex logistics of overseas expansion. Her personal involvement in every aspect of expedition planning extended to the smallest details of ship construction, crew selection, and supply procurement. Isabella would personally inspect vessels before they were approved for oceanic voyages, interview key crew members to evaluate their competence and loyalty, and review inventories of supplies to ensure that expeditions carried everything necessary for extended operations in unknown territories. The religious ceremonies that blessed each expedition before departure reflected Isabella's conviction that her overseas expansion served divine purposes as well as political and economic objectives. She would personally attend these services in the royal chapel, offering prayers for the success of voyages that would carry Christian civilization to the ends of the earth, while also generating the wealth necessary to support further expansion. The morning of October 12, 1492, found Isabella kneeling in prayer in the royal chapel at Granada, the last Muslim stronghold in Spain, having finally surrendered after a siege that had consumed months of careful planning and enormous resources. But even as she offered thanksgiving for this triumph of Christian arms, her thoughts were focused on the westward voyage that Christopher Columbus was conducting somewhere beyond the horizon, an expedition that would either vindicate her faith in impossible dreams or demonstrate the limits of human ambition. The news of Columbus's success reached Isabella on March 15, 1493, delivered by a travel-stained messenger who'd ridden without rest from the port where the admiral's ships had returned, with evidence of lands that European maps had never shown and peoples who had never heard of Christ or Castile. Isabella received this intelligence in the same modest chamber where she had spent her final night before coronation, and her reaction was characteristically controlled despite the magnitude of what had just been accomplished. As she listened to the messenger's account of islands filled with gold, of native populations ready for conversion to Christianity, and of vast territories waiting to be explored and claimed for Castile, Isabella understood that the teenage dreams she had nurtured during those quiet afternoons at Madrigal Castle had become reality beyond anything she could have imagined. The woman who had begun her remarkable journey as a powerless princess was now the architect of discoveries that would reshape the entire world. The documents that Isabella studied in the weeks following Columbus's return painted a picture of opportunities that staggered even her expansive imagination. Charts showing the approximate locations of the discovered islands were spread across her desk, weighted down with silver candlesticks to prevent them from curling in the humid air that drifted through the palace windows. Each map represented not just geographical knowledge, but the foundation of an empire that could dwarf the achievements of Rome or Byzantium. Her daily routine during this extraordinary period began each morning with extended consultations in the royal treasury, where administrators calculated the resources that would be necessary to exploit Columbus's discoveries effectively. The numbers were staggering. Ships would need to be constructed by the dozens, crews recruited and trained for voyages that might last months, and supplies accumulated for expeditions that would establish permanent settlements rather than mere trading posts. Isabella's breakfast meetings with Ferdinand during the spring of 1493 focused intensively on the practical challenges of transforming discovery into conquest. The islands that Columbus had found were inhabited by peoples who possessed no knowledge of European warfare, no immunity to European diseases, and no understanding of the political and economic systems that would soon be imposed upon them. These circumstances created opportunities for expansion that had never before existed in human history. The correspondence that flowed through Isabella's chambers during this period came from throughout Europe, as foreign courts sought to understand the implications of Castilian discoveries in the Western Ocean. Portuguese representatives demanded immediate negotiations about territorial boundaries in the newly discovered regions. French ambassadors inquired about opportunities for their merchants to participate in trade with the Western Islands. Most troubling, papal representatives arrived with questions about the spiritual obligations that discovery created for Christian rulers. Isabella's response to these international pressures revealed the strategic brilliance that had enabled her survival during years of domestic conflict. She understood that exclusive control of Western exploration would provide Castile with advantages that could transform the balance of European power, but she also recognized that maintaining such control would require diplomatic skill as well as military strength. Her negotiating position was strengthened by the simple fact that only Castilian ships had successfully crossed the Western Ocean and returned with proof of their discoveries. The administrative structures that Isabella established during the summer of 1493 created the governmental framework for managing territories that stretched across thousands of miles of ocean. She appointed Columbus as governor of the discovered islands, but insisted on detailed reporting requirements that would ensure royal oversight of all colonial activities. More importantly, she established procedures for claiming additional territories that future expeditions might discover, creating legal mechanisms for imperial expansion that could continue indefinitely. Her daily schedule during this transformative period included regular meetings with ship captains and navigators who were preparing for follow-up expeditions to the Western Islands. These conversations took place in Isabella's private study, where technical discussions about wind patterns and ocean currents mixed with strategic planning about the establishment of permanent settlements that could serve as bases for further exploration. The religious dimension of Isabella's colonial planning reflected her genuine conviction that the discovered territories provided unprecedented opportunities for expanding Christian civilization. She established training programs for missionaries who would accompany future expeditions, developed guidelines for converting indigenous populations, and created administrative procedures for building churches and establishing religious communities in the Western Islands. The practical preparations for large-scale colonization involved challenges that had never before been faced by European administrators. Isabella supervised the selection of colonists who would establish permanent settlements in the discovered territories, reviewed proposals for agricultural development that could make the islands self-sufficient, and coordinated the transportation of livestock, seeds, and tools that would be necessary for creating European-style communities thousands of miles from home. Her evening meals during this period were working dinners where experts in various fields contributed their knowledge to the planning of expeditions that would establish Castilian dominance throughout the western regions. Italian engineers described the construction techniques that would be necessary for building fortifications in tropical climates. Portuguese merchants, despite their government's official opposition, provided confidential information about the challenges of managing overseas territories. Most valuable of all, former crusaders shared their experiences with conquest and settlement in distant lands populated by non-Christian peoples. The financial mechanisms that Isabella developed for funding colonial expansion involved innovations that would influence European imperial administration for centuries. She created systems for sharing the costs and profits of exploration among private investors, royal treasury, and colonial administrators. These arrangements provided incentives for efficient management while ensuring that the Crown retained ultimate control over territorial and commercial policy. Isabella's personal involvement in colonial planning extended to the most detailed aspects of settlement organization. She reviewed proposals for the layout of colonial towns, specified the types of buildings that should be constructed first, and established procedures for distributing land among colonists. Her vision encompassed not just temporary trading posts, but permanent communities that would reproduce Castilian civilization in the Western territories. The intelligence reports that reached Isabella throughout the autumn of 1493 provided increasingly detailed information about the geography, resources, and populations of the discovered islands. Columbus's second voyage, launched with a fleet of 17 ships and over 1,000 colonists, sent back regular dispatches describing gold deposits, suitable harbors, and indigenous communities that showed varying degrees of resistance to Spanish settlement. Her response to these reports demonstrated the systematic approach to imperial expansion that would characterize Spanish colonial policy for generations. Isabella established procedures for evaluating and exploiting discovered resources, created administrative systems for governing indigenous populations, and developed military strategies for suppressing resistance to Spanish authority. Each decision was carefully calculated to maximize both immediate profits and long-term territorial control. The daily routine that Isabella maintained during the winter of 1493 reflected the enormous scope of the imperial project she was directing. Her mornings began with reviews of colonial dispatches and administrative correspondence. Her afternoons were occupied with planning sessions for future expeditions. Her evenings were spent in diplomatic negotiations with European courts that were increasingly concerned about Spanish expansion in the Western Ocean. The maps that covered the walls of Isabella's study during this period showed not just the islands that Columbus had discovered, but also the vast oceanic spaces that remained unexplored. She would spend hours studying these charts, tracing possible routes for future expeditions, while calculating the resources that systematic exploration would require. Her vision extended far beyond the initial discoveries to encompass territories that might contain wealth and opportunities beyond anything yet imagined. Her correspondence with colonial administrators revealed the careful attention she paid to every aspect of imperial governance. Isabella insisted on detailed reports about indigenous populations, natural resources, agricultural potential, and strategic considerations that might affect future expansion. She wanted comprehensive information that would enable informed decision-making about policies that would determine the success or failure of the entire colonial enterprise. The religious services that Isabella attended during this period included special prayers for the success of missionary activities in the discovered territories. She had established requirements that every expedition include priests who would work to convert indigenous populations to Christianity. These religious obligations were not merely ceremonial additions to colonial policy, but fundamental aspects of Isabella's vision for creating a global Christian empire under Spanish leadership. The practical challenges of managing territories separated by thousands of miles of ocean required Isabella to develop communication systems that had never before been attempted. She established regular sailing schedules for ships carrying dispatches between Spain and the colonies, created procedures for emergency communications during crisis situations, and developed coded messaging systems that would protect sensitive information from interception by rival European powers. Her daily meetings with Ferdinand during this period focused increasingly on coordinating their respective resources for the massive undertaking of systematic colonial expansion. Ferdinand contributed his extensive knowledge of Mediterranean trade and naval operations, while Isabella provided her understanding of administrative law and her remarkable ability to inspire loyalty among officials who would be operating far from royal oversight. The contracts that Isabella negotiated with expedition leaders during the spring of 1494 established precedents for imperial administration that would influence European overseas expansion for centuries. She insisted on detailed provisions for claiming discovered territories, establishing governmental authority over indigenous populations, and ensuring that the Crown received appropriate shares of colonial revenues. These agreements created legal frameworks for territorial acquisition that could be applied systematically as Spanish exploration expanded throughout the western regions. The financial resources that Isabella devoted to colonial expansion during this period represented a significant portion of Castile's total royal revenues. She understood that initial investments in exploration and settlement would be enormous, but she also calculated that successful colonial development could generate wealth that would dwarf any previous source of royal income. The gamble was enormous, but the potential rewards justified risks that would have seemed impossible just a few years earlier. Her personal supervision of colonial supply operations ensured that expeditions carried everything necessary for establishing permanent settlements in territories where European-style communities had never existed. Isabella reviewed inventories of tools, weapons, livestock, seeds, and manufactured goods that would enable colonists to create self-sufficient communities while also maintaining the military strength necessary to defend their settlements against indigenous resistance. The administrative innovations that Isabella implemented during this period created governmental structures that could manage an empire spanning multiple continents and thousands of miles of ocean. She established new departments responsible for colonial affairs, appointed officials with specific expertise in overseas administration, and developed procedures for coordinating policy between metropolitan and colonial governments. The intelligence network that Isabella maintained provided regular information about Portuguese activities along the African coast and their responses to Spanish discoveries in the Western Ocean. These reports revealed growing Portuguese concern about Spanish territorial claims and increasing competition between the two kingdoms for dominance in overseas exploration and trade. Isabella's response to Portuguese pressure involved a combination of diplomatic negotiation and military preparation that demonstrated her sophisticated understanding of international politics. She participated in talks that would eventually produce the Treaty of Tordesillas, dividing the world between Spanish and Portuguese spheres of influence, while simultaneously strengthening Spanish naval forces and accelerating colonial expansion to establish facts on the ground that would support her negotiating position. The daily routine that Isabella established during the summer of 1494 reflected the increasing complexity of managing an empire that was expanding faster than anyone had anticipated. Her mornings began with colonial correspondence and administrative planning. Her afternoons were devoted to diplomatic negotiations and military coordination. Her evenings were spent reviewing reports from explorers who were discovering new territories that extended Spanish claims far beyond the original islands that Columbus had found. The maps that she studied during this period showed an increasingly complex picture of Spanish territorial claims throughout the western regions. Each new expedition returned with information about additional islands, mainland coasts, and indigenous populations that expanded the scope of the imperial project beyond anything Isabella had originally envisioned. The scale of opportunity was matched only by the magnitude of the administrative and military challenges involved in effective territorial control. Her correspondence with colonial governors during this period revealed the careful attention she paid to maintaining royal authority over administrators who were operating thousands of miles from direct supervision. Isabella established detailed reporting requirements, created inspection procedures for colonial operations, and developed disciplinary mechanisms for officials who exceeded their authority or failed to implement royal policies effectively. The religious dimension of Isabella's imperial vision took on increased urgency as reports arrived describing the enormous indigenous populations that Spanish expeditions were encountering throughout the discovered territories. She established expanded missionary training programs, increased funding for colonial churches, and developed theological guidelines for converting populations that numbered in the hundreds of thousands and possessed sophisticated cultures that had never encountered Christianity. The economic opportunities that colonial expansion was creating required Isabella to develop entirely new approaches to managing international trade and territorial development. She established procedures for evaluating and exploiting colonial resources, created mechanisms for regulating trade between Spain and the colonies, and developed tax systems that would generate revenues from territorial acquisitions while encouraging continued expansion and settlement. Her personal involvement in every aspect of imperial administration extended from the grandest strategic decisions to the most mundane practical details. Isabella would personally review proposals for colonial town layouts, evaluate applications from potential colonists, and approve contracts with suppliers who provided the tools and equipment necessary for establishing European-style communities in tropical environments. The morning prayers that began each day of Isabella's reign during this extraordinary period included petitions for divine guidance in governing territories that were expanding faster than any previous empire in human history. She understood that the responsibilities she had assumed through colonial expansion involved not just political and economic administration, but also spiritual obligations to populations that had never encountered Christian civilization. As 1494 drew to a close, Isabella's daily routine had evolved to encompass the management of an empire that stretched across oceans and continents that had been unknown to European geography just 2 years earlier. The teenage princess, who had once traced ancient carvings in a castle chapel, was now directing expeditions that would reshape the entire world, establishing the foundations of a global empire that would endure for centuries and transform human civilization in ways that even her extraordinary imagination could not have fully anticipated. The dawn of 1495 found Isabella standing at the windows of her private chambers in the Alcázar of Seville, watching merchant ships preparing for departure to the Indies as the morning mist rose from the Guadalquivir River. The sight of those vessels, their holds filled with colonists and supplies for territories that had not existed on any European map just 3 years earlier, reminded her daily of how completely her world had transformed since that first desperate message from Columbus. Her morning routine had evolved to accommodate the crushing administrative demands of governing an empire that seemed to expand with each returning ship. Before the first light touched the river, Isabella would already be kneeling in her private chapel, a small chamber adjacent to her sleeping quarters, where she could pray without the elaborate ceremonies that accompanied her public religious observances. The stone floor was covered with simple rush mats that provided minimal comfort against the cold, but Isabella had learned during her years at Madrigal to find strength in physical discomfort. The prayers she offered during these early morning hours were no longer the personal petitions of a princess seeking guidance for her own future, but the anguished supplications of a ruler bearing responsibility for millions of souls scattered across thousands of miles of ocean. She prayed for the safety of colonists establishing settlements in hostile territories, for the success of missionaries attempting to convert entire civilizations, and for the wisdom to govern peoples whose languages, customs, and beliefs were utterly foreign to European understanding. After prayers came the first administrative session of each day, conducted in a small chamber that had been converted into a working office where maps, correspondence, and official documents covered every available surface. Isabella would sit at a simple wooden table, still wearing the plain woolen robe she used for morning prayers, while a carefully selected group of secretaries and advisors briefed her on developments that had occurred during the night. Ships arriving from the colonies brought dispatches that might be months old, but which required immediate attention from the only person in Spain with authority to make decisions affecting the entire imperial enterprise. The correspondence that arrived with each fleet from the Indies painted an increasingly complex picture of territorial expansion that was proceeding faster than anyone had anticipated. Columbus's reports from his third voyage described vast mainland coasts that extended far beyond the original island discoveries. Other expeditions were encountering indigenous empires with sophisticated political structures, advanced agricultural systems, and military capabilities that would require entirely new approaches to conquest and administration. Most troubling of all, some colonial administrators were reporting tensions between Spanish settlers and native populations that threatened to explode into warfare that could destroy years of careful diplomatic and missionary work. Isabella's response to these challenges revealed the systematic approach to problem solving that had enabled her survival during years of domestic political crisis. She understood that effective imperial administration required not just military force, but also legal frameworks, economic incentives, and religious institutions that could create stable governmental structures across vast territories populated by diverse peoples. Her morning planning sessions involved detailed discussions of legal codes that would govern colonial societies, administrative procedures for managing territorial expansion, and military strategies for defending settlements against both indigenous resistance and potential European rivals. The breakfast that followed these planning sessions was a working meal where Isabella consulted with specialists in various aspects of colonial administration. Portuguese merchants who had defected to Spanish service provided confidential information about the challenges of managing overseas territories. Italian bankers explained the financial mechanisms that would be necessary for funding continued expansion while generating profits for private investors. Former crusaders shared their experiences with conquest and settlement in distant lands, offering practical advice about maintaining military discipline and civilian morale during extended campaigns in unfamiliar environments. Her daily schedule during this period included regular meetings with shipbuilders, navigators, and suppliers who were preparing the constant stream of expeditions that carried colonists, soldiers, and supplies to the expanding territories. These conversations took place in workshops and warehouses throughout Seville, where Isabella would personally inspect vessels before approving them for oceanic voyages. She had learned to evaluate ship construction with the expertise of a professional naval architect, understanding that the survival of entire expeditions might depend on the quality of hull timbers, the adequacy of sail configurations, and the reliability of navigation instruments. The practical challenges of coordinating activities across such vast distances required Isabella to develop communication systems that had never before been attempted in human history. She established regular sailing schedules for dispatch vessels that carried official correspondence between Spain and the colonies, created procedures for emergency communications during crisis situations, and developed coded messaging systems that would protect sensitive information from interception by Portuguese or French agents who were increasingly active in monitoring Spanish colonial activities. Her afternoon schedule typically included diplomatic meetings with representatives from other European courts who were demanding information about Spanish discoveries and seeking opportunities for their own merchants to participate in colonial trade. These negotiations required Isabella to balance competing pressures from allies who expected commercial privileges, rivals who threatened military action if excluded from territorial development, and papal representatives who insisted on oversight of missionary activities among indigenous populations. The maps that covered the walls of Isabella's working chambers during this period showed an empire that was expanding so rapidly that cartographers could barely keep pace with new discoveries. Each returning expedition brought reports of additional territories that extended Spanish territorial claims far beyond anything anticipated in the original colonial planning. The scale of these discoveries was creating administrative challenges that had never before been faced by any European government, requiring innovations in law, finance, and military organization that would influence imperial administration for centuries. Isabella's personal involvement in colonial policy extended to the most detailed aspects of settlement planning and indigenous relations. She reviewed proposals for the layout of new colonial towns, specifying the types of buildings that should be constructed first, and establishing procedures for distributing land among colonists. Her instructions covered everything from the location of churches and government buildings to the agricultural techniques that should be used for growing European crops in tropical climates. The evening meals that Isabella shared with Ferdinand during this period were intensive working sessions where they coordinated their respective resources for the massive undertaking of systematic imperial expansion. Ferdinand contributed his extensive knowledge of Mediterranean naval operations and his understanding of the diplomatic complexities involved in managing relationships with other European powers. Isabella provided her expertise in administrative law and her remarkable ability to inspire loyalty among officials who would be operating far from direct royal supervision. Their conversations during these evening sessions revealed the enormous scope of the imperial vision that was taking shape through Spanish territorial expansion. They discussed not just the immediate challenges of governing existing colonies, but also the long-term possibilities for expansion that might carry Spanish influence throughout the Western Hemisphere and beyond. The territories that Spanish expeditions were discovering seemed to extend indefinitely, creating opportunities for empire building that could potentially surpass the achievements of any previous civilization in human history. The religious services that punctuated Isabella's daily routine took on increased significance as reports arrived describing the enormous indigenous populations that Spanish colonists were encountering throughout the discovered territories. She had established requirements that every expedition include priests who would work to convert native peoples to Christianity, but the scale of the missionary challenge was proving far greater than anyone had anticipated. Entire civilizations with millions of inhabitants were being brought into contact with European culture for the first time, creating opportunities and obligations that tested the limits of conventional religious understanding. Isabella's response to these missionary challenges involved the establishment of new training programs for priests who would serve in colonial territories, the development of theological guidelines for converting populations that possess sophisticated cultures, but no knowledge of Christianity, and the creation of administrative structures for building churches and establishing religious communities throughout the expanding empire. She understood that successful colonial administration would require not just military conquest, but also spiritual transformation that could create lasting bonds between Spanish authorities and indigenous populations. The financial resources that Isabella devoted to colonial expansion during 1495 represented an enormous gamble with the future of Castile itself. The costs of maintaining regular shipping to the colonies, supporting growing settler populations, and defending territorial claims against both indigenous resistance and European rivals were consuming significant portions of royal revenues. But the potential returns from successful colonial development appeared to justify investments that would have seemed impossible just a few years earlier. Her personal supervision of colonial supply operations ensured that expeditions carried everything necessary for establishing self-sufficient communities in territories where European-style settlements had never existed. Isabella reviewed inventories of tools, weapons, livestock, seeds, and manufactured goods that would enable colonists to reproduce Castilian civilization while maintaining the military strength necessary to defend their communities against potential threats. The administrative innovations that Isabella implemented during this period created governmental structures that could manage territorial expansion proceeding faster than any previous empire in human history. She established new departments within the royal bureaucracy specifically responsible for colonial affairs, appointed officials with specialized expertise in overseas administration, and developed procedures for coordinating policy between metropolitan and colonial governments separated by thousands of miles of ocean. The intelligence network that Isabella maintained provided regular information about Portuguese activities along the African and Asian coasts, French exploration in northern territories, and potential threats from other European powers who were becoming increasingly concerned about Spanish dominance in overseas expansion. These reports enabled her to anticipate and counter diplomatic or military challenges before they could threaten established colonial territories or interfere with planned expeditions. Her daily correspondence with colonial governors revealed the careful attention she paid to maintaining royal authority over administrators who were necessarily operating with considerable independence due to the vast distances involved in imperial communications. Isabella established detailed reporting requirements that covered every aspect of colonial administration, created inspection procedures for evaluating the performance of overseas officials, and developed disciplinary mechanisms for dealing with administrators who exceeded their authority or failed to implement royal policies effectively. The practical challenges of governing territories populated by peoples who possessed no knowledge of European law, religion, or political systems required Isabella to develop entirely new approaches to imperial administration. She established procedures for incorporating indigenous communities into Spanish governmental structures, created legal frameworks for regulating interactions between colonists and native populations, and developed economic policies that would encourage colonial development while protecting indigenous interests according to Christian principles. Her evening study sessions during this period focused on reports from explorers who were discovering territories that extended Spanish territorial claims far beyond the original Caribbean islands. Mainland expeditions were encountering indigenous empires with sophisticated political structures, advanced agricultural systems, and military capabilities that would require careful diplomatic and strategic planning to incorporate into the expanding Spanish domain. The maps that Isabella studied during these evening sessions showed an increasingly complex picture of territorial opportunities that seemed to extend indefinitely throughout the western regions. Each new expedition returned with information about additional coasts, river systems, and indigenous populations that expanded the scope of potential Spanish expansion beyond anything that European political theory had previously contemplated. Her correspondence with missionary leaders revealed the enormous challenges involved in converting populations that numbered in the millions and possessed cultural traditions that had developed independently of any European influence. Isabella established expanded training programs for colonial priests, increased funding for missionary activities, and developed theological guidelines for adapting Christian teachings to cultures that had no previous exposure to European religious concepts. The economic opportunities that colonial expansion was creating required Isabella to develop innovative approaches to managing international trade and territorial development that had never before been attempted by any European government. She established procedures for evaluating and exploiting colonial resources, created mechanisms for regulating commerce between Spain and the overseas territories, and developed tax systems that would generate revenues from territorial acquisitions, while encouraging continued expansion and settlement. The winter months of 1495 brought news that would reshape Isabella's understanding of the scope of her imperial project. Expeditions exploring the mainland coasts were reporting the existence of indigenous empires that possessed wealth, sophistication, and military power, far exceeding anything encountered in the original island discoveries. These civilizations controlled vast territories, commanded armies, numbering in the tens of thousands, and possessed gold and silver resources that could potentially dwarf all previous sources of European wealth. Isabella's response to these intelligence reports demonstrated the strategic brilliance that had enabled her political survival during years of domestic conflict. She understood that conquering these indigenous empires would require military and diplomatic capabilities far beyond anything needed for establishing settlements on sparsely populated islands. But she also recognized that successful conquest could provide resources that would enable Spanish expansion on a scale that could transform the entire balance of global political and economic power. The planning sessions that occupied Isabella's days during the early months of 1496 focused on developing strategies for conquering and governing indigenous empires that possessed sophisticated military capabilities and political structures. These discussions involved detailed analyses of indigenous warfare techniques, evaluations of Spanish military advantages and vulnerabilities, and calculations of the resources that would be necessary for mounting successful conquest campaigns in territories located thousands of miles from European supply bases. Her correspondence with military commanders during this period revealed the careful attention she paid to every aspect of campaign planning for expeditions that would attempt conquests unprecedented in the scope of their ambitions. Isabella insisted on detailed intelligence about indigenous military capabilities, comprehensive logistical planning for extended campaigns in unfamiliar territories, and systematic preparation for governing conquered populations that might number in the millions. The daily routine that Isabella maintained during this extraordinary period reflected the enormous complexity of directing an imperial enterprise that was expanding faster than any government in history had ever attempted to manage. Her mornings were devoted to colonial administration and expedition planning. Her afternoons were occupied with diplomatic negotiations and military coordination. Her evenings were spent reviewing intelligence reports and strategic assessments that would determine the future of an empire whose ultimate boundaries remained unknown. The religious services that she attended during this period included special prayers for divine guidance in governing territories and peoples that were being brought into contact with Christian civilization for the first time in human history. Isabella understood that the responsibilities she had assumed through colonial expansion involved not just political and economic administration, but also spiritual obligations to populations whose eternal salvation depended on the success of missionary activities that she was directing from thousands of miles away. As 1496 progressed and reports continued arriving of new territories, new peoples, and new opportunities for expansion, Isabella began to grasp the full magnitude of what Spanish exploration had unleashed. The modest expeditions that had begun with Columbus's search for a westward route to the Indies had evolved into the foundation of an empire that could potentially encompass entire continents and transform the course of human civilization itself. The teenage princess who had once spent quiet afternoons at Madrigal Castle dreaming of conquest and expansion was now directing the creation of a global empire whose ultimate extent would not be determined for generations to come. Every decision she made in her daily routine of imperial administration was shaping the future of millions of people scattered across territories that were still being discovered by explorers whose voyages carried Spanish authority to the ends of the earth and beyond the limits of any previous human imagination. The morning of October 12th, 1492, would prove to be the most consequential dawn in human history, though Isabella could not have known it as she knelt in the chapel of the military camp outside Granada's walls. The last Muslim stronghold in Spain had finally fallen after centuries of warfare, but even as she offered prayers of thanksgiving for this triumph, her thoughts drifted westward across the Atlantic, where Christopher Columbus was sailing into waters no European had ever seen. The siege camp that surrounded Granada was unlike any military installation Isabella had previously commanded. Instead of the temporary fortifications that characterized most medieval warfare, her engineers had constructed what amounted to a permanent city designed to outlast any defense the Muslim garrison could mount. The royal pavilion where she maintained her headquarters was built from timber hauled across hundreds of miles of Spanish countryside, its walls hung with tapestries that depicted previous Castilian victories, while maps of the besieged city covered every available table. Her daily routine during the final months of the Granada campaign began each morning before dawn, in a simple tent that served as her private chapel. The canvas walls did little to muffle the sounds of an army preparing for another day of siege operations, but Isabella had learned to find spiritual focus amid the chaos of military life. She would kneel on a small carpet placed directly on the hard ground, her hands clasped around a silver crucifix that had belonged to her mother, while her chaplain led her through prayers that placed the day's work under divine protection. The morning briefings that followed took place in the command tent, where her military advisors spread detailed maps of Granada's defensive positions across rough wooden tables. Isabella would lean over these charts with the intensity of a scholar studying ancient texts, tracing the locations of enemy artillery positions, analyzing the effectiveness of previous assault attempts, and calculating the resources necessary to maintain siege operations through another winter. Her questions revealed a grasp of military engineering that impressed even veteran commanders who had initially doubted whether a woman could effectively direct such complex operations. The correspondence that arrived with each dawn brought news from throughout her expanding domains, but increasingly, the most important messages came from agents monitoring Portuguese activities along the African coast. These reports described gold mines and trading posts that were generating unprecedented wealth for Castile's rival kingdom, reminding Isabella daily of the opportunities that awaited successful overseas expansion. She understood that conquering Granada was merely the final step in consolidating her domestic power. The real work of empire building lay across the oceans that surrounded the Iberian Peninsula. Her breakfast during these final months of the Reconquest was typically shared with Ferdinand and their senior military commanders, meals that served as informal war councils where tactical problems were debated and strategic decisions refined. The food reflected the practical constraints of siege warfare, consisting mainly of preserved meats, hard bread, and wine that had been transported from supply bases hundreds of miles away. But Isabella had learned during her years of civil war to find satisfaction in simple fare, understanding that sharing hardships with her followers created bonds of loyalty that elaborate court ceremonies could never match. The daily inspections that occupied her mornings involved riding through the siege lines to observe artillery positions, supply depots, and the elaborate earthworks that her engineers had constructed to contain Granada's garrison. Isabella would mount her war horse, a magnificent Andalusian stallion bred specifically for military service, and spend hours examining every aspect of the siege operations. Her riding costume was designed for practical use rather than ceremonial display, consisting of sturdy leather boots, reinforced woolen garments, and a simple steel helm that provided protection against enemy arrows while allowing clear vision and communication with her officers. The intelligence reports that reached her command tent each afternoon provided increasingly detailed information about conditions inside Granada's walls. Spies who had managed to infiltrate the city described dwindling food supplies, growing tensions between military and civilian leaders, and secret negotiations among various factions who were beginning to consider surrender terms. This intelligence enabled Isabella to calibrate her siege strategy, alternating between military pressure and diplomatic overtures that would encourage capitulation while minimizing the destruction of a city she intended to incorporate into her expanding kingdom. Her afternoon planning sessions focused increasingly on the administrative challenges of governing territories that would be liberated through Granada's fall. Isabella understood that military conquest would be meaningless unless it was followed by effective governance that could win the loyalty of Muslim populations while establishing the foundations for Christian civilization. She spent hours reviewing legal codes that would govern the treatment of conquered peoples, economic policies that would encourage agricultural and commercial development, and religious procedures for converting mosques into churches, while respecting the rights of populations that had lived under Islamic rule for centuries. The evening meals in Isabella's pavilion during the final weeks of the siege were attended by a carefully selected group of advisors who represented the various constituencies that would need to be managed once Granada fell. Military commanders provided updates on siege operations and garrison morale. Church officials discussed plans for establishing Christian institutions in territories that had been under Muslim rule for over 700 years. Most importantly, merchants and administrators offered practical advice about governing urban populations that possessed sophisticated commercial and artisan traditions, but had never experienced Christian political authority. Her personal study during this period was filled with maps and documents that revealed the scope of the imperial vision taking shape in Isabella's mind. Charts showing Portuguese progress along the African coast were spread alongside speculative drawings of possible westward routes to the Indies. Reports from Italian merchants described the enormous profits generated by Asian spice trades, while correspondence from various explorers outlined proposals for expeditions that could establish Castilian trading posts to rival Portuguese achievements. The wooden table where she worked was scarred by compass points and ink stains from months of intensive planning for overseas expansion that would begin as soon as domestic conquest was complete. The religious services that punctuated each day of the siege took on special significance as Isabella prepared for what she understood would be the final triumph of Christian arms over Islamic resistance in Spain. The field altar erected in her command tent was decorated with captured Muslim banners that symbolized previous victories, while the prayers offered before each day's military operations emphasized divine support for a cause that promised to restore Christian authority throughout the Iberian Peninsula. These ceremonies served both spiritual and political functions, reinforcing the religious character of the reconquest, while demonstrating to her followers that their queen shared the hardships and dangers of military life. The letters that Isabella composed during her evening hours were addressed to correspondents throughout Europe and beyond, as she worked to build the international relationships that would be necessary for successful overseas expansion. Her correspondence with Italian bankers explored the financial mechanisms required for funding large-scale expeditions, while her letters to various royal courts sought technical expertise in navigation, shipbuilding, and colonial administration. Most intriguingly, her exchanges with Portuguese sources provided confidential information about the challenges and opportunities of establishing permanent settlements in territories populated by peoples who had never encountered European civilization. The practical preparations for post-conquest administration occupied much of Isabella's daily routine during Granada's final weeks of resistance. She reviewed proposals for converting the city's magnificent Alhambra palace complex into a Christian royal residence, while also planning the construction of new churches and governmental buildings that would demonstrate the permanence of Castilian authority. Her instructions covered everything from the treatment of Granada's famous libraries to the administration of agricultural lands that had been cultivated using advanced irrigation techniques developed during centuries of Muslim rule. The morning when Granada's gates finally opened to receive Castilian forces found Isabella dressed in ceremonial armor that had been specially crafted for the occasion. The polished steel breastplate was decorated with religious symbols that proclaimed the Christian character of her victory, while her helm was surmounted by a plume of white feathers that could be seen from great distances. As she rode through the defeated city's streets, acknowledging the submission of populations that had resisted Castilian rule for generations, Isabella understood that she was witnessing the end of an era that had shaped Spanish history for over 7 centuries. The ceremony that formally transferred control of Granada to Christian authority took place in the courtyard of the Alhambra, where Muslim officials surrendered the keys to the city, while Isabella's chaplains offered prayers of thanksgiving for what they proclaimed as divine vindication of Christian righteousness. The symbolic importance of this moment extended far beyond the immediate military victory, as Isabella and her supporters understood that completing the reconquest would free Spanish resources for the overseas expansion that had been planned during years of domestic warfare. The administrative challenges that immediately followed Granada's conquest required Isabella to demonstrate the governmental skills she had developed during decades of political struggle. The city's population included not just Muslim soldiers and officials who had directed the resistance, but also thousands of civilians whose cooperation would be essential for successful integration into the expanding Castilian kingdom. Her policies toward these conquered peoples combined practical tolerance with systematic encouragement of Christian conversion, creating frameworks for cultural assimilation that would influence Spanish imperial administration for centuries. The celebration banquet that marked the completion of the reconquest was held in the same hall where Muslim rulers had entertained guests for generations, its walls decorated with intricate geometric patterns and Arabic calligraphy that testified to the sophisticated civilization that had flourished under Islamic rule. Isabella's decision to honor this architectural heritage while adapting it for Christian use reflected her understanding that effective governance required respect for local traditions as well as assertion of new political authority. The correspondence that flowed through Granada during the weeks following its conquest came from throughout Europe, as foreign courts sought to understand the implications of Spanish success in completing the reconquest. Portuguese representatives arrived with proposals for coordinating overseas expansion to avoid conflicts between the two kingdoms' territorial claims. Italian merchants requested commercial privileges in territories that Spanish expeditions might discover. Most significantly, papal representatives came to discuss the spiritual obligations that military victory had created for rulers who now possessed unprecedented opportunities to expand Christian civilization into distant lands. Isabella's response to these international overtures revealed the strategic thinking that had enabled her political survival during years of domestic conflict. She understood that completing the reconquest had established Spain as a major European power, but she also recognized that maintaining this status would require successful overseas expansion that could provide the wealth and territorial extent necessary for competing with established kingdoms like France and England. Her negotiations with foreign representatives were polite, but non-committal, as she worked to preserve maximum flexibility for the imperial projects that were already taking shape in her planning. The daily routine she established in Granada during the winter of 1492 reflected the transition from military commander to imperial administrator that would characterize the remainder of her reign. Her mornings began with administrative sessions where she addressed the practical challenges of governing newly conquered territories. Her afternoons were devoted to planning the overseas expeditions that would carry Spanish power beyond the Iberian Peninsula. Her evenings were spent in diplomatic discussions with representatives from various European courts, who were increasingly interested in Spanish intentions regarding territorial expansion. The maps that covered the walls of her new study in the Alhambra showed not just the completed reconquest of Spain, but also the oceanic spaces that remained to be explored by expeditions already under preparation. Isabella would spend hours examining these charts, calculating distances, analyzing wind patterns, and studying the technical reports submitted by navigators who claimed that sailing westward across the Atlantic might provide a direct route to the wealth of Asia. The wooden desk where she worked was covered with correspondence from Christopher Columbus, whose persistent advocacy for westward exploration was finally receiving the serious consideration it had long deserved. The religious services that she attended in Granada's converted mosques took on special significance as Isabella prepared to launch expeditions that would carry Christian civilization to territories that had never encountered the gospel message. The transformation of Islamic sacred spaces into Christian churches symbolized the broader cultural changes that Spanish expansion would bring to lands and peoples scattered across unknown continents. Her prayers during these services included petitions for divine guidance in governing territories that might contain populations numbering in the millions and possessing sophisticated cultures that had developed independently of European influence. The practical preparations for overseas expansion that occupied Isabella's days during the spring of 1493 involved challenges that had never before been faced by European administrators. She supervised the construction of ships designed specifically for oceanic exploration, reviewed contracts with suppliers who would provide the food and equipment necessary for voyages that might last months, and interviewed potential colonists who would establish permanent settlements in territories that existed only in the calculations of visionary navigators. The financial resources that Isabella devoted to these preparations represented an enormous gamble with the future of Castile itself. The costs of building exploration fleets, recruiting and training crews, and supplying expeditions for extended operations in unknown territories consumed significant portions of royal revenues that had been strained by years of military campaigns. But the potential returns from successful overseas expansion appeared to justify investments that could transform Spain from a regional European power into the foundation of a global empire. Her personal involvement in every aspect of expedition planning extended to the smallest details of ship construction and crew selection. Isabella would personally inspect vessels before approving them for oceanic voyages, understanding that the survival of entire expeditions might depend on the quality of hull timbers, the adequacy of sail configurations, and the reliability of navigation instruments. Her knowledge of maritime technology had developed through intensive study with sea captains and shipbuilders who possessed practical experience with the challenges of long-distance ocean travel. The morning when Columbus returned from his first voyage found Isabella kneeling in prayer in the royal chapel at Barcelona, where news of his success had reached her after weeks of anxious waiting. The messenger who brought word of islands filled with gold, of native populations ready for Christian conversion, and of vast territories waiting to be explored and claimed, for Castile delivered intelligence that transformed every assumption about Spanish possibilities for territorial expansion. The documents that Isabella studied in the days following Columbus's return painted a picture of opportunities that staggered even her expansive imagination. Charts showing the approximate locations of discovered islands were spread across her desk, each map representing not just geographical knowledge, but the foundation of an empire that could rival the achievements of Rome or Byzantium. The reports describing indigenous populations natural resources, and strategic possibilities created administrative challenges that had never before been faced by any European government. Her immediate response to these discoveries demonstrated the systematic approach to imperial expansion that would characterize Spanish colonial policy for generations. Isabella understood that transforming discovery into conquest would require not just military force, but also legal frameworks, economic incentives, and religious institutions that could create stable governmental structures across vast territories populated by diverse peoples. The planning sessions that occupied her days during the spring of 1493 involved detailed discussions of legal codes for governing colonial societies, administrative procedures for managing territorial expansion, and military strategies for defending settlements against both indigenous resistance and potential European rivals. The correspondence that flowed through her chambers during this extraordinary period came from throughout Europe, as foreign courts sought to understand the implications of Spanish discoveries in the Western Ocean. Portuguese representatives demanded immediate negotiations about territorial boundaries in newly discovered regions. French ambassadors inquired about opportunities for their merchants to participate in trade with the Western territories. Most troubling, papal representatives arrived with questions about the spiritual obligations that discovery created for Christian rulers, who now possessed unprecedented opportunities to expand their faith into lands that had never heard the gospel message. Isabella's vision during these transformative months extended far beyond the immediate islands that Columbus had discovered to encompass territories that might contain wealth and opportunities beyond anything yet imagined by European political theory. The teenage princess who had once spent quiet afternoons at Madrigal Castle dreaming of conquest and expansion was now directing the creation of a global empire whose ultimate boundaries would be determined by expeditions that carried Spanish authority to the ends of the earth and beyond the limits of any previous human imagination. The morning prayers that began each day of her reign during this extraordinary period included petitions for divine guidance in governing an empire that was expanding faster than any administration in human history had ever attempted to manage, while the evening study sessions that concluded her daily routine were devoted to planning expeditions that would transform the entire course of human civilization. The entire course of human civilization. The autumn winds that swept across the courtyards of the Alcázar in Seville carried with them the salt scent of ships preparing for voyages that would dwarf even Columbus's revolutionary expeditions. Isabella stood at her chamber window on the morning of September 25, 1493, watching as carpenters put finishing touches on vessels whose holds would soon carry not just explorers, but entire communities prepared to establish permanent Spanish civilization in territories that stretched beyond the horizon of European imagination. Her daily routine had evolved into something that would have been unrecognizable to the teenage princess who once knelt on cold stones at Madrigal Castle. The morning prayers that began each day now encompassed petitions for souls scattered across thousands of miles of ocean, for colonists facing dangers that no European had ever encountered, and for the wisdom to govern peoples whose very existence had been unknown just months before. The first administrative session of each day took place in a chamber that resembled nothing so much as a ship captain's quarters, with charts covering every wall and dispatches from the Indies stacked on tables that groaned under the weight of correspondence from an empire expanding faster than any government in history had attempted to manage. Isabella would arrive before dawn, still wearing the simple woolen robe she used for prayer, to review overnight developments in territories where the sun was setting as Spanish morning began. The intelligence reports that greeted her each morning painted an increasingly complex picture of opportunities and challenges that tested every assumption about imperial governance. Columbus's second voyage had departed with 17 ships and over 1,000 colonists, creating the largest European expedition ever launched into unknown waters. But the dispatches returning from this massive undertaking described not just additional islands and gold deposits, but indigenous empires with sophisticated political structures and military capabilities that would require entirely new approaches to conquest and administration. Her breakfast conversations with Ferdinand during this period focused on coordinating resources for expeditions that were revealing the true scope of what Spanish exploration had unleashed. The territories their ships were discovering seemed to extend indefinitely westward, creating possibilities for empire building that could potentially surpass any previous civilization in human history. Each morning meal became an intensive planning session where they calculated the ships, soldiers, and supplies that would be necessary for systematic colonial expansion across territories whose boundaries remained completely unknown. The correspondence that arrived with each returning vessel brought news that transformed Isabella's understanding of her imperial responsibilities with startling regularity. Reports from expedition leaders described mainland coasts that extended far beyond the original island discoveries. Colonial administrators sent detailed accounts of indigenous populations that numbered in the hundreds of thousands and possessed cultural traditions that had developed independently of any European influence. Most significantly, explorers were beginning to encounter evidence of vast inland empires that controlled enormous territories and commanded military forces that could potentially challenge Spanish expansion, if not handled with extraordinary diplomatic and strategic skill. And so, we reach the end of our gentle journey through the extraordinary life of Isabella of Castile, the young girl who rose from a drafty castle to become the architect of a global empire that would reshape human civilization itself. From those first tentative steps across cold flagstones to the morning prayers offered for souls scattered across unknown oceans, we have witnessed the transformation of a powerless princess into history's most consequential female ruler. Sweet dreams, dear friend. And may your rest be as peaceful as the quiet moments Isabella once found in contemplation at Madrigal Castle, before the world called her to greatness beyond imagination.